Hello, hello. My name is Amana, and my mantra is Be Love. I am host of the Heart of the Soul podcast, and I am a woman and mother, a witch dancing in the mountains, and I am a midwife of souls as I walk with women and others through the portals of birth and death.
Lovely. And I'm Kate, and I am the host of Wild Sacred Journey podcast, and it's the founder, if we want to call it that, of the Wild Sacred Journey, the business, and the hearth fire that is the business, I suppose, of some kind. Although I think maybe I'd be more of a campfire than a hearth fire. So I would say, yeah, I work in many ways as an edge walker, work and live in many ways as an edge walker, and channel for wisdom of some kind. And yeah, a guide. And I would say, I work shamanically, and we'll probably get into this in a moment, because that feels like such a challenging thing to say, to kind of claim that title, because it's a complicated title with a lot of complicated history around it. But yeah, for me, what that kind of means is someone who straddles the idea that there's this world that we feel and we sense with our physical bodies and our physical senses. And then there's these other layers of experience that all kind of layer right on top of each other. And people who are the shamans, the wise women and men, the medicine people, are, whatever the different names for them are, the different flavors of it, all of them are in some way kind of building bridges between those worlds, those different worlds, and listening in for where there's harmony and where there's dissonance and where there is rupture that's wanting repair, and tending to that, not just in individuals, although that's part of it, but also then in the relationships individuals have with the world around them and the collective, and then, like on all the levels. So I would say that's kind of where my work is. And in many ways it's elemental. It's very much earth and body based, but also deeply, deeply spiritual. And I am coming to you from while I'm kind of in this extended pilgrimage kind of space in my life. And, I'm playing a lot with a lot of the themes of like what it is to live in pilgrimage. And maybe we'll kind of get into that too, because Amana, I know you've had periods of your life where that's kind of been more, motherhood is really your journey right now, and not to say that that isn't pilgrimage in its own way, but that you've, other times in your life where you've really been in that sort of nomadic pilgrimage kind of space.
Yeah.
So
I love that you just immediately, when you started talking about shamanism, went in with like your hands, which are such like these like energetic tools that we use in that flow as well. And I just thought maybe we could just presence that we have both guested on each other's shows in the past.
yeah, yeah.
Now this is like a collaborative episode where we're gonna co-create and share. Each of us are gonna share stories and ask each other questions throughout the
Hmm.
flow.
Yeah. Yeah. So neither of us is the host and neither of us is the guest, and we're both the host and we're both the guest. Yeah.
Things. And yes, like you, I have yes, people have called me shaman before. People have called me as a medicine woman. They have brought me into those spaces where shamans live. And um ah, and I have struggled. I have not wanted to, I don't know. I've had this like inner battle of whether or not I should take on that label. Uh, and yet I also feel like I have had these affirmations that yes, it's okay, and yes, I should. And yet there's still this part of me that I don't know, feels a little bit unsteady with it, or just not sure how other people might receive it, and not wanting to offend people. And I'm not really sure what what to do that with it or what I will do with it in the future. And so I appreciate you bringing up this line of dialogue and claiming your
Yeah.
medicine woman.
Yeah, I want to kind of circle back to something that you said there in a moment, if you're okay with that. But I think for me, some of how I'm kind of bridging that gap right now, at least, is saying I work shamanically rather than claiming I am a shaman.
Uh,
And there's something about that that feels accurate to me in the sense that, yeah, I have been trained by people who work in shamanic lineages
mm,
and I work shamanically, and yet I have never even though people have granted me that title in certain spaces, I don't come from a lineage where I was an apprentice to a shaman who called themselves a shaman and who at some point said, "You are now a shaman or the shaman," or that, we don't have the cultural context anymore. I think a lot of us, particularly those of us of settler colonial descendancy, right? So those of us in what we might quote unquote call white bodies or of European ancestry who no longer live in Europe and haven't probably for generations and live on lands where we've been there for generations, and yet we are not the original peoples of those lands.
mm,
Um, And in fact, when our ancestors came to them, they didn't come with the intention of being in relationship with the land. They came with the intention of extracting from the land. And so, I draw that distinction too, because migration has always been true. And I think even the idea of the original peoples of a land is a complicated idea, actually. Um, but I think for me, where I draw that distinction is, were we coming to be in relationship and actual kinship with a place, or were we coming to dominate and extract from? And with kind of this empire exploitation, industrialized mindset already kind of internalized and then perpetuated out in how we approached the people who were there before us and the land.
do you, I'm, as you
Yeah,
speak, I'm curious. Sometimes I've thought about like my ancestors are from Sweden and Scandinavia, and of course there are also like stories of shamans or witch, shaman type people there as well. And so sometimes I wonder, like, if we go back far enough, do we all, in some sense, have some ancestry who were like at one with the land and held, you know,
absolutely.
you know, shamanic type practices with those of our community.
Absolutely. I 100% believe that. And I think where I think the word shaman starts to feel complicated is, from my understanding, the only indigenous medicine practitioners who called themselves shamans were from like Russia, Siberia,
Mm-hmm.
um, and possibly kind of up into Lapland,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of definitely the Russia, Siberia area. And
Mm-hmm.
then anthropologists, mostly European anthropologists, took that term and started applying it to indigenous medicine people all around the world, but that most of them have their own words for themselves in their own native indigenous tongues.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think part of what we feel shaky about, those of us from this descendancy of, European settler colonials, is that we have to go back so much further to find that connection in our lineages. I mean, it depends on where in Europe you're from, or where your ancestors were from. But a lot of those had ruptures from those forms of medicine well before, particularly, so I'm thinking particularly like in the Celtic Isles, right? So, you know, England got whatever practices there were in England, if they were still there at the time of the Roman Empire, were pretty much destroyed once the Roman Empire kind of moved through. They lasted a little bit longer, maybe in Ireland and Scotland, because the Roman Empire never made it there. But then, even before the Roman Empire, there were church mission, there were, so anyway, the Catholic Church and the missionaries, and, because some of it too is most indigenous cultures that had strong connections with those um, forms of medicine, those approaches to healing, those cosmologies, and this might be where we can kind of tie into that theme that we were kind of thinking we might dance around, is that, but most of those places, they were oral traditions.
Mhm.
And that's part of what I think begets such a layered understanding of the world, is because you're actually trying, you're not storing wisdom in books, you're storing it in your heads and you're sharing it, you're transmitting it orally. And you're not just storing it in your head, you're storing it in the land and you're storing it in your relationships because you remember then, I had this conversation with this person in this place. And that's where this idea came from. And so the idea then is connected to the conversation, which is connected to the person, which is connected to the place where you were when you had the conversation. So all of that is getting stored, not in books, but in relationship, you know? And so when that happens, you have a different understanding of kinship, of these different layers of experience. Like you had, I think we had brains that were more used to looking at the world in these different layers of things that were happening at the same time. So you were storing entertaining, right? A myth that seems like just an entertaining story for kids, right? It also stores history. It also stores genealogy. It also stores science, geology and topography and, like all kinds of stuff, biology, like it stores all of these different layers of, and then also spirituality and like those bigger senses of why are we here and how do we be meaningful and purposeful in being here and be here in a good way, so that we're contributing to more beauty and more aliveness in the world and not just taking and leaving things worse than we found them.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think there's something about being in an oral tradition that almost, yeah, that supports this layered understanding of the world that once you start writing things down into books, you can segment out like suddenly the wisdom isn't stored in the relationship and in a place. It's stored over there and it's separate from this other information that's stored over here, which is separate from this other information, which is stored over there, right? And so suddenly we have more fragmentation. We have more of a fixed sense of things, right? It like changes the way our brains are wired actually to like think about the world, which is part of why, too, a lot of indigenous peoples, from my understanding, recognize what we might call in these days neurodivergency as being the edge walkers, as being the medicine people and the shamans, because their brains are webbed in ways that actually make it easier for them to sense in between worlds. And by they, I mean, I'm probably in that category myself.
Yeah.
But I include me in that actually. But so there was like a role for that brains that worked that way because yeah, the synthesis of all these different flavors and textures and nuances of being alive and being human and being here, yeah, all needed to kind of be woven together.
Yeah, and certain people's like natural ability or affinity to that type of work, I feel like is what I'm hearing you speak about as well. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I mean, I definitely think, I absolutely think that if we go back far enough, and for some people that might mean going back quite far, actually, I seem to be really drawn to like Neolithic, megalithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, we're talking like 3 to 5,000 years ago, seems to be where I'm most drawn. I tend to gravitate towards places in the landscape that I get there and I find out there's like tons of those types of sites around. Like that's like where I seem to be drawn. Um, and we may not have to go back that far, but yeah, I absolutely believe all of us have something in our lineage, have some ancestors, if we go back far enough, who lived in a different way than our current modern trajectory seems to be taking us on.
Like, I mean, we're all here because our ancestors knew how to like be one with the earth and that's how they survived, right? Like, or I feel like that's one aspect. And maybe it's more than a few generations back. And then, like, for me, one thing, because I'm definitely called to midwifery type care,
Hmm.
like with birth and death. And it was interesting for me to then realize that even my own maternal grandmother was called to birth
Mhm.
community and feel like, ooh,
Mhm.
it's like
Mhm.
in my bones in a way. It's, in so many, it's also in the cosmos. And when I did my Mayan astrology, I was a white electric world bridger. And I was just
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, okay. Like, yes, world bridger. It's what I'm already like, what I've already been drawn to and felt like is my soul's path is to be present with the coming and going of souls. And so that just affirmed what the path that I was already on.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it is. I mean, we can always look. I remember my grandma talking about her mom and, you know, before anything bad happened to anybody in the family, like, or right after anything bad happened to anybody in the family, like an accident, a fall, or whatever, the phone would ring and she'd be there going, "What's wrong?" And she just knew. And everyone's always kind of like, "Oh, that's weird," but but again, I feel like intuition is like is kind of like creativity, that we've put it on this pedestal and we assume only some people have it. And there's kind of this like genius factor with it. And it's like, we all have it. Some people are, I think, just more attuned to that, whether because they've experienced a lot of trauma and they've become deeply sensitive as a coping mechanism, or whether they just were kind of born that way and are just naturally like, I am a very, very porous person. If you look at my human design, if you look at my astrology, if you look at my Enneagram, any of them will tell you, any of the wisdom, like the meaning making tools out there will kind of tell you, like, yes, I'm meant to just merge into oneness with all things. And that's kind of my natural state. And remembering that I'm like not everybody else around me and have my own body is like that's my, that's my work in life. Yeah. So I am very, yeah, just kind of naturally open to all of that. But, the thing that through all the training that I've done, the thing that keeps coming back is like, it's actually just a deep, deep listening. Because so this is the other thing too, is when we're in kinship with beyond humans, so like our earliest ancestors would have known the different songs of birds, not just because they were interested in bird watching, right? But because birds, if you could hear when a bird call switched to a warning that a predator was coming, and you could hear the trajectory of how the bird call moved through the trees, you could hear what direction. First off, you'd hear it long before our human senses would know that a predator was coming,
Yeah.
because the birds would know well before we would. And then you could actually even track what direction it was coming from based on the sounds in the forest, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, that's probably more instinct rather than intuition, but it's still a form of extrasensory knowing that we find through deep listening and trusting that humans are not the be all end all and our brains are not the be all end all, and that there's actually, again, this whole web around us, this whole ecosystem that is in relationship with itself and us and each other, and we're a part of it. And if we feel ourselves a part of it, we have access to, and we know how to listen deeply. We have access to so much more wisdom and knowledge than we could ever read in a book, you know?
Yeah, like you're saying, I think knowing how to do something, but also practicing it. Like I also believe we all are intuitive. We all have mediumship abilities. We don't
Hmm.
need to pay a medium to be able to communicate with your ancestors. Sometimes
Hmm.
you want to have a communication through someone else because it brings a different layer and the messages can feel different when it's coming through someone else. But I believe that
And sometimes it's clearer because we have our
right,
own, like,
we
you
muddy
know,
things up
yep,
sometimes.
yep, yeah.
Yes. But yes, intuition, it's also like a muscle that we can practice, or we can not choose not to practice it. And then, of course, that sense isn't going to become greater and stronger if we're not practicing it. And I feel like in this modern era where we have, telephones and we can look things up so easily just on our screen, that we haven't practiced as much the like the intuitive knowing and
Mhm.
like, but people still have those experiences of thinking of someone and then their phone
Yeah,
rings, right?
right.
And also I've practiced with friends just the simple practice of communicating with them through the cosmos without our phones, but then later at a later date, did you feel when this or that, or or them being like, I totally felt you the other day, and a line.
Or
I was thinking of them the other day. I went out on a hike by myself up the mountain. I was like super stoked, and but then I was like ruminating on this one thing about my husband, and I like have very spotty service up there. And then I was like, I'm just stop ruminating about it, just like go on to something else in my mind. And then my phone rings and it's him, and it's like him apologizing about the thing. And it was like,
yeah,
yeah.
I can, there's probably some people in my life who would be horrified if they knew how aware I was of how often I think they were thinking of me.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, oh, there you are again. Either talk to me or don't talk to me. But this is like, because again, because I think to your point, it's not just that we don't practice, it's also, and this is something I wanted to kind of say actually, that maybe we even pause here for a moment and just leave space for some grief, actually, or invite in and welcome in and acknowledge the grief that might be coming up in this conversation. Because I even felt some coming up earlier when you were kind of talking about the shaman. And I think yeah, I kind of want to circle back to that still. Um, but not only are we not practicing, we've been actively and purposefully disconnected from those things. And we've been taught to poo-poo them. We've been taught to think poorly and lesser of them, which is part of what kind of circles back a little bit to what I was saying at the beginning. We don't have a cultural context for these roles anymore because they've been erased from not only like our lived experience, but also even the way we think of the world and what we actually believe is possible in the world, you know? And that's a massive, massive fucking grief, right? Once we start to acknowledge that. And so, and it's not to say that there aren't people still trying to do the work, that the work isn't still coming through people. When I say it's been erased, I don't mean it's not still there trying to bubble up through humans. But, I think you probably experienced this too, like from a business perspective. One of my big griefs is like, yeah, there was a time when each village had their person, or even if each village didn't have the person, in some cultures the person actually was the edge walker, and they lived between villages, and they'd make the rounds, and to whoever their villages were, and they'd bring with them the stories, they'd bring with them poetry, they'd bring with them music, they'd bring with them news, they'd bring with them medicine, and that was part of the role. And again, if you look at ecosystems, I've been reading Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I know we've talked about her before when we've,
That one, yeah.
yeah. So, and I love that she's talking about, because I often think about it this way too. And she's so much more of an ecologist than I am. So she can bring a lot more specificity to it than I can. But, she's talking about what if we started thinking about economy as ecology, right? And she's talking about like the gift economy of we have the trees who stand still, and part of why they produce beautiful fruit that attracts the birds and the bugs and they give that away to them is because they can't move. And so it's a gift. They offer a gift for the ones who can move, so that the ones who can move want to come, and then it's so much of a gift that they then can, they do what they do in moving around, which is helping spread the seeds through their poop or through their feathers or through, whatever, their little legs with the pollen on it, like, so it's, and in a, we tend to think of that in this like, well, the trees have evolved because they would die out if they didn't, right? That scarcity mindset. And her point is like, we have to stop thinking about it from that scarcity mindset and reframe that as they can only produce berries when they have an abundance, actually, an abundance of sugar, an abundance of, sunshine that they've photosynthesized to create something. And so when they have the abundance, they give it away and they store that abundance. She talks about storing abundance in the belly of your brother, and that's a very indigenous idea. We don't hoard, we share. and give excess away. And when you give excess away, that begets something else within the community that feeds and nourishes the relationships, and that relationships are actually the health and the wealth. But anyway, my point being, what if humans are kind of the same, right? And so we have the ones who are meant to stay still, and then we have the ones who are meant to move between them. And so sometimes that was the medicine people and, the edge walkers, um, the cross pollinators, but whether the villages had the medicine person or the medicine person moved, people knew what they were, knew what their role was, knew when they needed them, and knew how to welcome them in and receive what they had to offer. And, I think a lot of us struggle in these times trying to bring this work through in the world because we have to do so much more explaining what it is we even offer, educating people on what it is, how they should even know that they need us, because they literally often don't know that they need us, and when they need us, how to actually welcome it in, how to work with it. It's like, we also, and I make it sound like such a burden to say we have to bear the brunt of that. And it is what it is. I don't, and I trust that there's some reason for that in these times. Um, but yes, all that to say, yeah, it makes things more complicated when we don't have, and so you can say the word shaman and it's going to mean a ton of different things to a ton of different people. And it is probably going to offend some people because it's being used really problematically, actually, in a lot of cases. I think, my opinion, because it's being used to evoke an aesthetic rather than as a with an honoring of the cultural context that it was originally intended to be. And I'm not saying that to shame anybody, because if we don't actually know how to embody it, the hunger is why we reach for the aesthetic, because it's the closest thing we can get to the embodiment.
I was just embodiment was just like in my mouth too when you're saying it, because yeah, a label is different than actually embodying it and living it as your life. Like it's a way of life.
Yeah. Yeah, and because for many of us, like settler colonialism is a thing, and it happened, and it was violent, and it hurt everybody. Nobody actually won from that. That's a zero-sum game that nobody actually won from. And yeah, just that, there's grief in that too. Um, but I think one of the things that we have to reckon with in these times is we can't bypass that, and we have to acknowledge the harm in that. And that, yes, even though I am sure that somewhere in my lineage, there are ancestors who were shamans, although they might not have called themselves that. I don't know what their word for themselves was. And so I kind of use shaman because I don't have another word for it, even though I too feel a little like, ooh, sometimes about that word. It doesn't feel like it genuinely bubbles up from inside me. Um,
Yeah, like I shared with you earlier, it was actually finding in Lisa Lister's book about witches, was finding the term, a different type of witch called a shamana. And like for me, yeah, I was like, ooh, that actually, like a type of witch that's called shamana, that just felt, I don't know, it felt more, it landed for me in a different way.
hmm.
Yeah.
In Irish Gaelic, the Banfasa is the wise woman, basically. And that one kind of it lands for me in some ways. And the other piece of this too is that in most indigenous communities, becoming this was an apprenticeship model.
Hmm.
And I've read, I don't know, I've read this somewhere that women didn't usually step into their own shamanism, medicine womanism, their own leadership in the role, move out of apprenticeship and into their own mastery until their second half of life. They were postmenopausal before they actually became the medicine woman and really received that title. And up until then, they were in training and they were still doing good work. and they were still helping out in the community and they were learning. But the understanding was that women, because of our hormones and because of other things, we weren't actually prepared to really be that leader in that way that was necessary until that second half of life. And, men too, I think it probably wouldn't be until later because you don't have the lived experience yet. And you have to embody, and these were people who were in intact cultures and in theory had gone through um, rites of passage, at the right time, initiations at the right time, instead of like most of us in today's modern world who are going through our initiations in midlife because nobody guided us through them properly in our teenage years and then in our 20s and so we're trying to like get caught up and we're trying to kind of complete initiations that life was trying to initiate us, things were trying to initiate us and we didn't know what to do with it, and then we're like trying to catch up with it later in life. um so we feel behind, and yet even within intact cultures where in theory people were going through their initiations at the right times and their rites of passage at the right times, there was still often this understanding that you probably didn't really become the master healer until middle age and beyond, because it takes that long to embody it. It's not a weekend course. It's not a year-long course. It's not a label. It's not wearing the right clothes and then calling yourself it.
Right. No, I
You
mean, for
know?
me, it's been multiple sort of mentors or people that I'm learning from and life experience. And like I said, it's kind of a way of life, and the learning also never ends. The,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the that I continue to learn and grow and practice my skills, hone my skills, and they're also gonna be shifting and changing as I'm shifting and changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You were okay, cosmology. Can we
Yeah.
go back to that word and tell me more about what that means to you and yeah, how is that?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. I also wanted to, the thing I kind of wanted to
Oh,
circle
okay.
back to, well, I'm aware of our time too, and so I'm okay with moving on to cosmology, but I just wanted to name, like, I think it might be cool at some point, and so feel into whether this feels like the time, but to actually unpick a little bit of some of that feeling you were feeling, like when you think about calling yourself a shaman or a medicine woman, or when someone calls you that. I don't know if that feels like that's alive for you right now, or if that feels,
Yeah, I mean we can try. How would you help me to pick how would you like to pick at it
yeah.
using your words?
Yeah, pick maybe sounds kind of aggressive. I don't mean it like that. But I guess just to kind of open some more space for it. Because again, I think part of why I kind of wanted to go back to that, because it feels like this conversation kind of goes in two directions. And one is kind of a very theoretical, sort
Mhm.
of like slightly distanced, like, ah, yes, this is the history and these are the forces at play, and which I feel like is what I've kind of been speaking to. But there was something in what you were sharing that feels like it brings it into like the actual lived experience. And that's why I thought that might be cool, which, I mean, again, um, yeah.
Yeah, it's for me, I feel like it's partially like layered into my like inner good girl and not wanting
Mm,
to ever upset anyone, wanting to,
mm,
be the perfect woman, be the perfect girl, whatever, like be the good girl, do the right thing, not ruffle any feathers. And yet, like now in my 40s, I feel so there's like this like old self that held all of
hmm
that, would like at all costs keep the peace.
hmm
And
hmm
yet there's this other sort of maybe that future self of me and now in my 40s and in this different phase of life where I feel the both, and like I didn't want to ruffle any feathers, and now I'm sort of more willing to potentially ruffle feathers. I have more capacity for that I didn't have before.
What feathers do you feel like? you might ruffle to go right into it.
Just other ruffle the feathers of people around me that disagree or
Okay.
feel differently or might be offended by it. Or from my experience, it's often, or it has been in the past, just kind of other. And honestly, actually, now that I'm like, who has, like, nobody has actually come up to me and said, I don't, it's only been people coming up to me saying, you are this, from
Mm,
indigenous people in my life that I look to as mentors and, white European descendant people. And I feel like for me, I've maybe played more small. My voice has felt small for a lot of my life. And only now am I beginning to be able to use it as a greater tool and understand it as a tool and feel called from
mm,
my guides and my future self and the world to speak my unique truth and what
hmm
feels good and right to me, even if it's not in alignment with everyone. And no, I'm never going to be in alignment with everyone, and accepting that and like being
hmm
okay with that is has been a practice for me and continues to be.
hmm Yeah, it's fascinating. Even as you were talking about like that feeling smaller, it was like a little, like literally a smaller version of you, like kind of popped to the surface for a second there. It was pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, I hear in what you're sharing kind of like a couple layers, right? So one is maybe some version of what a lot of people are calling these days like the witch wound, right? And kind of this like, which I think too, I've kind of pointed to in the sense of like, yeah, the part of us that feels, mm, yeah,
Unsafe.
yeah, and that feels wobbly speaking to this kind of stuff because we've been so disconnected from it for for such a while, because it was erased from our culture intentionally in many
Mhm.
cases. And there have
Even
been
our,
generations.
like you were talking about before, it's like in the culture, but it's also like even in the written word of like women
Yeah,
who've been like suppressed and erased, right? It's
yeah,
only like males that were able to publish even until not even that long ago, or women were having to
right. The story of Mary Magdalene, right? And like that she like erasing that she was actually the 13th apostle and became actually his partner and his equal, and in particular in the transmission of embodied love, and yeah, and she just got, yeah, completely erased. And not even just erased, but like vilified, really thrown under the bus,
like
as it were.
like witches and like
Yeah,
midwives, like
yeah,
burned and
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's like a piece of that, right? And I think there's also a piece that it feels shaky because what happens when you disconnect a culture from their roots is, when you disconnect a culture from their land and from these specific roles, which were in many ways the bridges, the people who helped keep that connection alive and well, and helped moderate and facilitate that connection for the community with the land, with spirit, with this understanding that all of that is the same thing, like in its different layers. So when you uproot people from that, which is what settler colonialism does, right? And it takes people from a place where they used to belong and it puts them somewhere else to then wipe out the people who used to belong there, right? So when when you're taking that, you're literally cutting people off at the roots. So of course it feels wobbly to try and stand in those roles when we don't know what they would have called themselves. We don't have their names. We don't have the names for these roles in our ancestral tongues. And so again, there's a grief to that, I think. And of course, it's going to feel wobbly and weird because we're having to kind of make something or kind of put a band-aid on it, And I don't know, for me, it feels like part of it, and I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying, to say I work shamanically helps bridge that gap because it's like I don't need to claim a name for myself that I don't know, but I can say I'm somehow in this lineage,
Mhm.
even though that's, I, yeah, my role doesn't have a name, you know, I want to cry when I say that, but, that's, um, that's part of it. And I think there's a potential beauty in that in these times because we are birthing a new paradigm in these times because so many people are so disconnected from the land, even people who live on their ancestral land, have had some kind of rupture. And a lot of those lineages aren't intact anymore. And even the ones that are still more intact, the First Nations people of Turtle Island, the Sami people, the indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia, other people in the Mayan, like in South and Central America, right? Like you have some pockets where it's still more intact than maybe those of us from a lot of European traditions. But even those, they've been under, you know, intentional attempts to erase them for a long time too. And there's a lot of fraying and reclamation that's needing to happen. There's a lot of elders that have died that haven't had apprentices to learn from them before they passed. And, you know, for me, that's not mine to save necessarily, but to name and to grieve alongside of while I'm then looking towards my lineages and saying, how can I support their reclamation work by doing my reclamation work? And so I think that, yeah, so for me, so I'm hearing some of that in what you're saying, kind of that, yeah, some of that shakiness. Um, and I also, what was the other thing I was kind of hearing there too? Oh yeah, but also then something you were saying in like in the second half of life, kind of the really, and I think maybe this will bridge us into the cosmology, but this, you talking about the second half of life and kind of the words like having meaning and power. And I think, and maybe this is just me hearing something in you that I'm recognizing because it's mine, or maybe it's a both and situation, but I think it also scares me shitless, honestly, the amount of power that title holds. The
Mhm.
amount of, and not even power, power is not the right word. Responsibility, actually, I think is maybe a better word. And and I suspect part of the reason you don't fully step into that title until the second half of your life is I don't think you're actually ready to wield that level of responsibility with the right capacity and integrity until the second half of your life. Because I'm only just now, yeah, I just turned 40 only a month and a little bit ago. And I'm only just now starting to feel like, oh, I think I'm starting to step into the level of responsibility that within my own life and within my own self that then would allow me to really have the gravitas and the depth and the presence. Um, One of my teachers who I had on my podcast episode a while ago, she talked about the difference between taking the temperature and setting the temperature. And, that especially for those of us who are very sensitive, it's very easy for us to take the temperature, right? We're constantly sensing the world around us, what's going on out there. But recognizing our power and responsibility to set the temperature. What am I doing to actually, what presence am I holding that's rippling out around for me in a way that affects people? And, I was thinking about it too recently. I always am thinking about what am I calling myself and how do I describe what I do? But, you
Because
know,
we don't have the language, we don't
we
have like
don't
a
have the
language
language.
right now. So we're trying to grasp at other language and create new words to
Yes.
be able to explain, identify what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And to do it in words that maybe people would understand, and also that hopefully don't offend anybody, even though, like, obviously we don't actually have control over that. And, the best we can do, I mean, because here's the other thing too, right? Is like recently I've been really dropping into the space of like, I am not making any claims to any sort of like moral or ethical pure, like not ethical, but like moral purity or like any kind of purity. Like, I'm an imperfect person and I am doing my best from my heart at any given moment. And sometimes that's better than others. And it's getting better and better as I get older. But, along the way, like,
Practice, like, and we're humans and things are always changing. We're going to have different times where we have capacity that we don't and we do. And yeah.
and my training is based in yoga, which I only have access to because of settler colonialism. And my practice is trained in a mixture of indigenous wisdom traditions from Turtle Island. And I only have access to that because of settler colonialism. And I've been in pilgrimage in Scotland and Ireland and been exploring, the stories and songs and folk practices and, hopefully medicine practices of other Europe and, but I'm not German, I'm not Irish, I'm not Scottish, I'm not European, And so what is it to be like at some point we can't just be a not. Like we can't be a I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. At some point we have to claim I am something.
Mm.
And what I am is a mix of all of these other things. And there was a lot of violence that went into that mixing. And so it's not about bypassing that either. It's about acknowledging that and saying, okay, what can I do? What's my part to repair
Mhm.
in that while also honoring that the mixing has happened?
Yeah, I feel like it's so, death and grief have also been like huge teachers in my life. My
Mhm.
big initiation into death was when I was 25. And it is so important to like acknowledge the past, acknowledge and grieve what needs to be. Because if we don't, we just shove it down and it comes back
Yeah.
up. It doesn't
Yep.
go away. Yet if you don't sit with it, if you don't be with it, then it doesn't go away. It's still there. And also, I feel like we can also get stuck in, or I've felt
Yeah.
stuck in that at times in my life of just looking back and being with the grief and yeah, I feel like there was some importance in that. And I also feel like I'm shifting into this other phase where it's more about looking towards like what I like the world that I want to live in, the world that I want for my children, the world that I want to help co-create.
Mm.
And still, of course, grieving when things come up and making space and time and doing it in my way of ritual and ceremony and all the ways that grief can look. And also this of not like getting stuck in that eddy, but also like, oh, but what am I here to create? What am I here to help bridge and become this
Mhm.
like future that I refuse to see as some horrible war-torn world. Like I envision other things. I envision the
Mhm.
harmony and peace and love and the what I believe is possible as humans.
Mhm.
We are so capable of so many different things. Yes, we're capable of war. We've seen that. We've that's kind of boring old news. Yeah, we can kill each other,
Yeah.
but can we really like live in more
Yeah.
harmony with one another? And like you were speaking to from the Robin Wall Kimmerer book, The Service Berry, like storing things in our brother's belly. Like
Mhm.
we live
Mhm.
in a more communal way like that. And within, I don't know if it can be global, but who's to say that it can't be? Like we have to believe
Mhm.
that something's possible if
Yeah.
we're gonna help create that possibility. If we say
Yeah.
it's not possible, then you're already failing. It's never going to be if you don't believe that it could be.
One of the things that's occurring to me as you're speaking is how much, you know, I think we often speak to grief. I know I feel like I often end up advocating for grief in so many circles because the grieving isn't happening. And yet, as you're saying, at some point, and I felt this in my own body at times, the grief becomes an avoidance of this responsibility that we're talking about too, which is like, can I step into the fact that as a quote unquote healer or a shaman or a medicine woman or an edge walker or an initiator or whatever that is, that yeah, that there is massive responsibility with that. And along with that responsibility, we come back to that first word I use, which is power. And I think, and I don't mean, I think why I first shied away from that word is that we have such a misunderstanding of what power is because we live in these punitive justice systems that and these very hierarchical power systems. So when I say power, I'm not speaking of that kind of power, but I'm speaking of the power that like humans are creators. Like, when the Bible says like made in his image, to me that means like we are creators. And you see that everywhere. We're always creating, and we're either creating mess and harm or we're creating beauty. And I use creating too. Again, I think hustle and grind culture has us thinking of creating as a very like active, pushy kind of role. And I'm using creator, sure, in the making things with your hands and making things happen kind of way, but also in the like a creator, as in like sometimes a witness, like a witness is also a creator, right? Because it's affirming something back to itself through witnessing something else is allowed to unfurl when it's being witnessed.
Mhm.
And so that's an act of
But in
creation
which case,
too.
you're still a co-creator of the like experience in a bigger
Right.
sense.
Right. Because this is the piece too when we were talking about oral culture, right? Meaning and wisdom and knowledge wasn't ever one person. It was created through conversation like this.
Mhm.
If you look at Tyson Yunkaporta, I don't know if you've read any of his books, Sand Talk, and then Right Story, Wrong Story is his second one. Um, and so yeah, he's exploring where Aboriginal indigenous wisdom meets modernity, and kind of grappling with, yeah, with being his own edge walker in his own way, I suppose. Although he has not claimed that title for himself. I'm putting that on him, but kind of bridge builder, edge walker, kind of grappling with what do these mean in this time and yeah, how does indigenous thinking perhaps open up new possibilities for us in our times?
Mhm.
But one of the things he talks about is yarning, the sort of Aboriginal idea of yarning, which is that you sit down and you in circle and you talk together. And through that, some sort of deeper wisdom, deeper knowledge kind of comes forth, but that it never comes through in a vacuum with one person. It always comes through in the practice of yarning and in hearing different perspectives and sharing and weaving something that becomes greater than any one person. And that yarning then can also include, I mean, again, I can't speak for the Aboriginal people. I'm not Aboriginal, but my understanding of yarning then would also include that like the conversations we have with trees, with flowers. I saw this beautiful reel today where someone hooked up some daffodils to one of those little things where it was like a synth thing. And so they were hearing, it turned the vibrations of the daffodils into song. And so she tried this experiment of just like hearing them in the sunshine, and it was this beautiful sound. And then she stopped and she stuck her nose in and she smelled them and appreciated them. And the daffodils just like went crazy with their song. And so it's like when we witness beauty, beauty is fed
Yes.
and it's co-created. You're yarning in that moment with, I mean, I probably shouldn't say yarning because I don't want to misuse that word because again, words matter in the sense that they come from a very specific cultural context. But you're co-creating with the thing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Can we circle back to cosmology now?
Yeah.
I feel
I
complete.
Yeah, and I think this kind of bridges into so cosmology. So I'm kind of becoming really, I don't know, I feel like I'm like feeling fired up these days to like make a case for cosmology. Um, One of the things that I think we're struggling with in our modern world that's making it hard for us to find a way towards community and communion in a really divisive, fragmented times is that we've kind of gotten into this everybody's individual truth matters kind of box, which
Mhm.
is true, but it's only one part of the equation, which is that we used to also have shared cosmologies. And those were the bigger picture views that oriented us to like, why is the world, how did the world come to be? Why is it the way it is? What are the forces that keep it functioning? And what are our roles as humans within that keeping it functioning? So that could be science, it could be spirituality, it could be, it's probably, again, like we were talking about earlier, it's a hybrid of all of those things at the same time, would have been the initial understanding of that. Now we tend to be like, oh, well, the Big Bang happened and this and that, right? So our cosmology tends to be very science oriented, dried facts, and it doesn't tend to carry any story of how humans fit into it and what our responsibilities and roles are within it.
Hmm.
And I would submit that I think that's part of the reason we have epidemics of burnout. Part of the reason where a lot of people struggle with feeling purposeful and meaningful in their lives, which leads to low level anxiety and exhaustion and a sense of just kind of drifting without aim. Um, and so then we're kind of being fed this like self heal, self this, self that individual truth, right? And again, people's voices matter. People's individual perspectives matter. That's where the yarning comes in. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about that in the Serviceberry book, right? Like diversity is actually the antidote because you have connection rather than competition if everybody needs slightly different things. And if everybody sees the world in slightly different ways, and if everybody has something slightly different to contribute to the whole, because
Hmm.
then we're more likely to have everybody have some level of abundance that someone else needs. And then you have a gift economy. Whereas if everybody's the same and everybody needs the same things, you have competition and scarcity, right?
Yeah.
And which is part of what's gotten us to where we are today, which is more and more and more scarcity because there's more
Yes.
and more. Yeah.
So then so I feel like you've been speaking to it as a more like broad cultural thing now. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how cosmology, how like you live within
Mm-hmm.
that frame and how is your life maybe the same or different or yeah, how is that showing up in
Mm-hmm.
you versus the culture that you're in?
Yeah. So I think part of what's been teaching me that is sorry, weird noise behind me, and there's nobody else in the room, so I'm not entirely sure what just happened. Well, there's no other human in the room, but something else here. Um, yeah, so I think for me, some of that is um yeah, so one of my big teachers in this so far, I think, has been the presence of the roundhouse. So I felt called at one point to start like framing up a lot of my group offerings as taking place in a roundhouse, and when we can't do it in person, we do it virtually, but like by me invoking the presence of these roundhouses. So these are like we're going back to like megalithic, Bronze Age, type roundhouses. And as I've sat with the presence of them, because I think there's something that when you talk about the roundhouse, people kind of get it. And on some level, and all around the world, cultures seem to have built some of our earliest structures were roundhouses. And certainly a lot of sacred and ceremonial spaces were roundhouses. So why is that? A lot of that, I think, is because I got actually some of this idea from Scott Richardson Reed or Reed Richardson. He's Kaliak's herbarium on that's his that's his business. Um, and he does a lot of Scottish folk tradition and folk wisdom and folk stories and yeah, folk medicine. That's kind of some of his interest is in finding those things and kind of studying them and bringing them to light again. Um, but so yeah, so one of the things I was kind of reading that he was So, and again, this is the thing where if you read about it just online, like archaeologists, they don't tend to explore this part of it, right? But if you look at folk traditions, they would say, oh, they're probably built so that you enter the doorways through the east, and people probably slept in the west, and they probably cooked in the south, and you had the fire in the center. And I can't remember now what it was that you did in the north. But, you know, like all of that mirrors. So you literally might have your house set up so that as you engaged, as you moved through your daily activities, you were being reminded of what each of the directions meant and what the sun does in the sky and what the moon does and what the stars do. And so the house is a circle because the celestial bodies are circles and the way things move in nature are in circles, generally speaking. And so you would move through your day and you'd be living your cosmology. You would be reinforcing your understanding of how the world works and what your role is in that in every moment of your day, right? And because humans are creators, I suspect that some of what our role is to sing it back to the world, right? Like that's part of how the world keeps doing. One second. Nope.
Mhm.
There's a wild cat that likes to jump up onto the windowsill and then it eyes like the little open part of the window, like it wants to try and jump up and come in. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Yeah, you guys aren't coming in. Sorry, guys. Oh my God, there's two of them now. Okay. We're calling the cats in right now. We're really getting witchy here.
Yeah.
Yes, no, Bella, I know. Um, yeah, so yeah, so again with the daffodils, right? Like what if part of our thing is to witness the world and sing it back to itself, right? So
Mm,
in the same way that the world can mirror us back to us and help remind us of our role in things, we can witness how the world, the celestial bodies move. And by dancing the dance of the celestial bodies ourselves, we remind them to do their job,
mhm.
right? And like, God, that's beautiful.
Yes,
You
when you
know?
spoke of that, it made me think of like I've been having this like motion of like the never-ending figure of eight, like within my
Mhm.
body and using that a lot, even like meditation when I'm like sitting outside with the trees and just like feeling that flow of, of them to me, but also me to them and the
Yeah,
significance in that reciprocity, that offering what I offer them and what they offer me, and that it's the both and, like you're saying, and cyclical.
yeah.
You brought us back to the cycles and
Hmm.
the circles and the way our cycles go and the planets are moving and our wombs that are somewhat spherical as well.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm curious too. I want to, because I know we've both kind of been on pilgrimages at times. And one of the things too that I think pilgrimage is a living cosmology and or it's an attempt to live a cosmology, right? It's an attempt to put our bodies on the line for for what we believe, for faith, basically, right? I'm surrendering my limited ideas of what the world is, and I'm trusting in abundance, or I'm trusting in gratitude, or I'm being willing to go without for a while, or put myself through something in order to be on some kind of journey and to eventually maybe arrive somewhere with some sort of deeper sense of life and of being human and of spirit or God or whatever we want to call it, right? Some sort of deeper relationship. And so I think that's a practice of living cosmology. And so I guess I'd love to kind of like give you an opportunity if you want to share anything from like a pilgrimage or um yeah, like any kind of anecdote or story that yeah, that then might
Yeah.
kind of tie
But
in with this
oh,
based on what I've said.
yes, when you're speaking right then and sort of asking me this question, it of course made me think back to feel into my first experience of a pilgrimage, which was the Way of St. James in Spain, called El Camino de Santiago. And it's something that I did after I'd always wanted to live abroad. And so I was an au pair in France for a year, which was a big experience in and of itself. We were talking before we hit record of like being in another country and hitting
Mhm.
those like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a full year. And then at
Yeah.
the end of that full year, I was invited with another au pair that I had met, an American, to go on this pilgrimage,
Mhm.
this journey. And I've always loved the outdoors and have been, fairly athletic, but this was a whole new level of experience for me. And it was a really beautiful practice. I know it's become much more popular. There's more people doing this walk and pilgrimage now. But when I was doing it back in the early 2000s, there was still lots of people traveling, which was also beautiful as well. Like getting to meet so many people from different cultures, yet we were all on this like same walk. And yes, sometimes
Mm.
we like passed each other and then that person would rest and then we would catch up to them, or on and having this experience of like I didn't have a cell phone then, and each day I was just waking up to then walk and not always knowing, like I had a, landmark of where I maybe wanted to get that day, but I didn't always get there. And getting to be one with the land as we walked, like step by step by step, and looking to these beautiful like shell markings to show us the way, and getting to walk sustained with these other human beings from all over the world and hear their stories of why they were choosing this pilgrimage and their experience along the way, and other stories. I learned so much from so many different people, and also learning as an American with English as my first language to slow down when I was talking, to slow it down. And yes, I could speak some Spanish and some French, but we were often mostly communicating in English, and to learn to like simplify my words and stories and not use these complex words because they wouldn't be understood. And I just really, I mean, I look back at it still as one of the most fond months of my life, where each day, my goal was just to walk further on this path. And I only had like two different outfits and, a pair of hiking boots and a pair of flip flops and like three pairs of underwear, and just the simplicity in that, and this like individual journey that was happening within each of us, and then also with the people that I had the honor of walking alongside, and the different experiences. And when the alberg was totally full, but then the people in this village created this, space within this like old building where monks, would sleep. And I got to sleep in this bed of a monk. And it was just so
Mhm.
many different experiences that, especially for my 20 something self, it just opened up the possibility in the realm and the way people do things differently. I remember even in France seeing, pregnant women drink a glass of wine. And in America, you would be like publicly shamed if you saw any woman who was visibly pregnant and drinking a glass of wine. And just the ways that people were with each other and walking through these I loved because we walked through huge cities, but also through these like tiny towns, and seeing these old men standing in these cobblestone streets in the early hours of the morning singing just because,
Mhm.
and five little old ladies squeezed onto a bench just talking together in the town square. And it expanded my whole understanding of the world and what it was to be human and to see all the different ways. And, there were these women from Canada that had plenty of money. And then also this man that I came across that he had, just spent he'd come from some other country to do this, and he didn't have any more money left. Like
Mm.
it just, it enriched my life in a way that I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain or understand, but it changed me. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. That's beautiful. I think, yeah, one of the things that occurs to me as you're kind of sharing all that is that last piece, especially, right? That it changed you. And I think that's part of the point of living our cosmology is that we allow it to change us. We allow ourselves to actually be touched by something. And one of the things that's kind of been coming through for me is this idea that I think actually like an intact culture and part of the point of a more holistic cosmology, because again, I think we're going to have to kind of create some kind of cosmology because most of us have lost that. And we can look back to some of the old myths and stories, even the European ones, and we can start to find threads or, smoldering embers, whatever the analogy is we want to use. But we're still going to have to do some work, I think, to kind of make those into something that people will resonate with and want to organize themselves around so that we can start to build. This is kind of, I think, what my work is moving to is like, yes, there's the individual healing support I do, which I don't even like the term healing, but I use it because people recognize it. But there's that individual guidance and support that I do and kind of realigning and initiating and integrating, with folks. But then I feel like in many ways, what my work is in service to is kind of this, what cosmology can we create? What pieces, what threads, what embers can we kind of find and breathe some life back into or reweave so that we can create a cosmology that will speak to people in today's world so that we can bring our individual medicine, our individual voices and perspectives to the table, but under this larger umbrella of understanding of what it is to be human. Because right now I feel like we're without that North Star. And we can go to all the yoga retreats talking about finding your North Star that we want. And yes, it's important to know your North Star, but we as a species need a North Star. And it will be a little bit different depending on where we live. That's where I think we also need to look at like, because again, if we're including our beyond human relations in this, which include plants, animals, all kinds of creatures, landscape and geological features, water, whatever, all the things, right? Those are specific to locations. So some of it has to be specific to where we live. And there can also still be kind of this larger understanding. And so what's kind of some of what's been coming through for me is I suspect whatever cosmology we can bring forth in these times or we can find and recover has kind of one main foundation and then four pillars. And the main foundation is rhythm, which is that everything is about timing and rhythm, our heartbeat, the breath, water moving in and out, our moon cycles for people who bleed, um, yeah, just all of that, right? The opening and contracting, the opening and. So that's rhythm. It's seasonal stuff as well, right? We have inner seasons, we have outer seasons. Sometimes those are aligned, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's full summer and I'm in inner winter. Sometimes it's winter and I'm like, yeah, inner summer's coming out. Um, it's also age, I mean, young kids are spring, then we kind of get to the summer, then when you start getting to middle age and menopause and perimenopause, you're starting to get more into fall, then you get into crone, which is winter. So there's like all of those different seasonal things that are kind of happening and rhythms. But then the four pillars, I would say, so one is beauty, and I kind of view that as being in the north, right? And so that's kind of spirit because orienting principle of life is love and beauty. And then in the south, we have the balancing pillar of aliveness, and those two kind of balance each other and play off of each other, right? And if you have beauty without aliveness, you have superficiality. And if you have aliveness without beauty, you have suffering, right? Because aliveness is like the screams of childbirth, the screams of climax, the screams of rage, the screams of grief, right? And then even just the quiet, mundane moments, right? But like aliveness is like it's like the grit of like being here, you know? And then you have intimacy and discernment are the other two kind of balancing pillars. And so intimacy being the ability to be undefended, unarmored, so that we can actually connect, so that we can actually listen deeply, so that we can be in that co-creative space, so that we can receive, so that we understand that we're all interconnected and what we do like fucking matters, you know, it matters for everything that will come after us. I mean, when you were talking about the Camino, right? Yeah, you were on your individual journey and you were on this collective journey with the people you were ended up just kind of journeying with. And you were also in journey with all the people who have ever walked that Camino before you and all the people who will ever walk that Camino after you.
Yeah.
And like again, when we talk about responsibility, like there's a gravitas to that. Like if we really owned that what we did mattered, you know, what a vulnerability, like what an intimacy, right? But then we also have discernment, which is like boundaries. It's the thorns on the roses, it's the prickles on the gorse bush, you know, it's the like it's the shell on the turtle, right? Like it's the thing that says like also I'm unique. Also I have my own voice. Also I have my own journey. Also I have boundaries. Also I have finite resources. Like my body is finite, you know. My energy is even somewhat finite, you know. Energy itself as a concept is not finite, but the amount that moves through me and that I can tap into, you know, is it does have some finiteness to it. So you need those to balance each other too, right? Because you've got intimacy without discernment can lead to codependency. It can lead to like no boundaries. It can lead to just becoming a blob and ineffective. And discernment without boundaries is usually, or discernment without intimacy is usually being too armored, too cut off, too individualized, you know, disconnected. And so all of those kind of they each balance each other, opposites. Like I view discernment as being in the east and intimacy as being in the west. But they, you know, they also still all work together. And then kind of underneath them, they're all built on this platform of rhythm, you know, which is just the ebbs and flows between them at any given time. And so I feel like if we can keep orienting back to those kinds of things and then looking back and looking forward at the same time, you know, or again, in the right rhythm with each other. What were the stories that our ancestors told? What were the folk practices and the folk traditions that helped people belong to the place where they lived and belong to each other? And how do we embrace those without totally throwing out the baby with the bathwater in terms of all the, you know, the modern technology, right? Because that's got its own benefits and it's not going anywhere. I mean, unless the grid collapses tomorrow, in which case then it might actually be completely gone. But until the grid collapses, you know. But like I was having this conversation with somebody, and modern technology feels like it's all about shooting off into the stratosphere, right? It's like currency is becoming increasingly disconnected from anything actually tangible. Like it hasn't been connected to the gold standard for a long time. And now we have cryptocurrency, which is literally unconnected from anything tangible. It's completely made up, right? AI, completely made up, right? So we're getting the modern technology is moving us into this very imaginal visionary realm if we're looking at it from its most positive potential uses, right? Is in many ways it is kind of that oracle kind of like, you know, star baby, star seed kind of like, you know, heading out. Again, this is like if we're using it in its optimal form, it has the potential to be kind of that force. But right now, what it's doing is it's using earthly resources, both the literal ones and humans. Humans are an earthly resource, and extracting from them to propel itself up, and it's not giving anything back.
Yeah.
And so that's part of why I think, too, we humans are getting increasingly disconnected because we're following our modern stuff in these trajectories. And there's not enough of like we're in these bodies, we're living in these places, and we have a role and a responsibility to that. And we have to like, yeah, balance that back down again. And so that's where I think for me, some of that living cosmology is like, come back, come back, come back.
Calling
Like,
people back,
yeah,
calling yourself back. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you
And
for,
so, I hear that in your story of your pilgrimage, and I think there's a lot of different types of pilgrimage, and you don't always have to leave home to go in pilgrimage. And that's where I think, too, the living cosmology, with the roundhouse, there were roundhouses where people went to for medicine spaces and prayer and ceremony and repair work. And there were also just organizing your own daily tasks
Mhm.
to honor your sense of how the world works, so
Yes.
that even in doing the daily tasks, you're bringing that sense of like respect, gratitude,
Mhm.
reciprocity.
Remembering that in your
Hmm.
daily life. Yeah. I feel like we're sort of time to come to a close, but I am feeling like maybe I would love for you to just share with whoever's listening, like how they might work with you and what you bring in different ways, whether it's virtually or in person. And then,
Yeah, thank you. And I'll then turn that back around and invite you to share that too, for yourself. Yeah, so um, I do have seasonal roundhouse gatherings. That's a newer offering that I'm doing, and we do live gatherings around each of the solstice equinoxes, cross quarter days. People can come to individual ones, or, I definitely recommend if people can to kind of go through a year's journey with it. Um, and so, yeah, that takes place in our virtual roundhouse. And, there's some ceremony, some story, some like sort of guided transmission kind of stuff. But I also include a couple, in sort of a couple days to a week leading up to the thing, I send out a PDF that also has some suggested prompts that kind of go through so that you could actually start to do some research into like what maybe are your ancestral traditions. So I kind of talk people through how they can start to connect with some of their own possible ancestral like folk traditions. That's optional, but it's a way of, and then I also have like some journaling prompts. So there's like some self-inquiry or some research, and then I also make some suggested rituals. So it's kind of like following these ideas of, yeah, what was the first one? Oh, yeah, paying attention, researching, integrating, and embodying. And so those are kind of the four tenets that I kind of have there. So yeah, so that we're trying to kind of balance again, not just kind of the spiritual, like, oh, let's just connect with the seasons, but also like, how are we actually doing that? And not just invoking the ancestors, but how are we actually connecting to them, and doing some research or putting some rituals in place. And so yeah, so anyway, so I'm pretty excited about that. That's like just getting started and is kind of slowly growing. The first one we did was back for the spring equinox. So we'll have got one coming up for May 1st, kind of, it's not on May 1st, but around that. Um, and then, yeah, I do one-on-one work with folks, and, I speak a lot to kind of burnout, and burnout as this invitation to kind of a quiet revolution is what I'm kind of calling it. Like that it's not that you're broken, it's that you're an earthen pot trying to fit into a mechanized world, and you actually have different needs than what the world is giving you, and that's why you're burning out. And so, yes, you need rest and you need recovery. And we also need to then be building a world that we don't burn out in. And that's part of where I feel like the animist and ancestral wisdom helps give us a little bit of a roadmap. Because if we look around us at the world, we're going like what the fuck? There's no roadmap. I don't even know what I could create. And so when we look back and into our ancestry, into these long ago enough, we start to see a little bit of a map, some breadcrumbs. Um, so yeah, so that's kind of, so I do kind of what I'm calling like, yeah, one-on-one bespoke guidance for folks kind of wanting to approach their burnout in that way. Use that as a jumping off point. So I'd say those are kind of the main things right now. I'm also going to be bringing back an offering on sanctuary. I've also got I also actually have, kind of a signature talk around this that, if people listening are like, oh, like I know a bunch of people who'd like want to hear more about this, like, great, bring me into your community. Like I'd love to just share more about this with folks. Yeah. So those are kind of the main things. I created a free starter kit that people can find on my website, but it's going to need some updating. It was kind of one of those things where I just needed to get a first one out. And I stand by everything that's in there, but there's like a lot that's in there, and I'm not sure. I think it might actually be too much and kind of overwhelming for folks. So I think I'll be kind of paring it down and clarifying it a little bit in the not too distant future. But it's there if anybody wants to start on some kind of a deep dive
Yeah.
into more of how I see things.
And your podcast, of course.
Oh yeah, my podcast, of course. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so that's kind of yeah, that's what I've mostly got going on right now. So yeah, thank you for the invitation. So what about you, Amana? How can
Yeah.
people connect with you and how would
Yeah, so I also have a podcast, The Heart of the
yeah,
Soul, that publishes on full and new moons. I did start doing these weekly moon soul messages, which I'm sharing on Instagram, YouTube, and now also to my podcast. So those publish
amazing.
the different with the moon cycle each week. Full moon, the half waxing, new moon, half waning.
Mm,
Or I didn't say that correctly, but you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
And so those are free offerings that people are welcome to. And I just felt called to offer into the world. And then I do one-on-one work virtually and in person, mostly with women. And oftentimes in the seasons of like pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, I do birth trauma debriefs, birth integration sessions. Also for women who aren't going through like a physical birth of a baby, but like more of a metaphysical birth, birthing themselves anew in different ways. If you feel like you're in that like caterpillar into cocoon phase and you're emerging this next version of yourself and you're feeling like you might want some holding, tending, supporting through that process. I love to walk alongside women as they are unearthing themselves again. And I'm
Mm,
also a practicing medium, so I also do intuitive mediumship readings virtually. And I'm going to be starting in the future, probably in June when my energy is ready for it. As I'm completing some other projects, I'm going to be offering like a full moon virtual group gathering and a new moon group gathering. So
mm,
more to come on that.
yeah, awesome.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a fun balance to hear us both talking about because I feel like you're kind of at the thresholds of birth and death, and I'm kind of at like the everything in between, and not that you're like not tending to people in between those things too, but really from that energy of birth and death, and then yeah,
Yes. And again, like you were speaking to, we need our unique,
yeah,
focus. Like
yeah,
these are where I used to
yeah,
question that I was drawn to these places and this is where I'm meant to be. But now I fully like embody, embrace that these are the spaces I'm meant to be in. And
mm,
I love that you're like in these other spaces and we need you too. So
yeah,
love it.
yeah, yeah, amazing.